Okay, so good morning, folks. Thank you very much for attending the European Semiconductor Laser Workshop. I hope you are all doing well. And so this is the second online meeting for this ESLW. I hope it's the last one. I hope next year we will be able to meet all together. So can you hear me? Can we start? Yes? It looks good. Okay. So just before we start the technical program, I would like just to remind you a few information. So as you can see, we are going to use Zoom. You should have received the links for the today. So just be careful that there is a link for today and another one for tomorrow. Okay. The other point is pay attention to your microphone. So keep your microphone muted during the talks, okay? Because we are going to be quite a lot of people online. So just make sure that your microphone is off. And during the when you want to ask question, it's better if you use the raise hand function available on Zoom. If we are running out of time and if you still have some question, there is a special chat link which is available at the bottom of the slide, so you can actually meet with other people. It's very easy. You just enter your name and you can just you will be directly in the room and you can converse with other people. Okay, so that's all for this one. We are gonna record the presentation on YouTube. If really you don't want me to do it, just send me an email. What we want to do is to at the end to have something that can be accessible for 1 or 2 months for people, and then we will delete, of course, the presentation, but we want to make it available for people for 1 or 2 months. In case you have any technical question, you can use this this email address, ESLW 2021@telecomparis.fr. And if you are a speaker, try to get in touch with me and with your session chair in advance to make sure that we want just to make sure that you are with us and we can rely on your participation. Okay, right. So something we will have is the best student paper award. That is sponsored by MDPI Applied Science. So we have quite a lot of submission from students. So we will give this prize tomorrow afternoon, and the award will be a certificate. And of course, the name of the student will be written afterwards. Okay, so don't miss this this last part of the conference tomorrow afternoon. All right, so this is the different session we are going through. So we are in the opening session, and in this opening session, we will have 2 talks from the Zurich women scientist. We will start with Professor Ursula Keller for a keynote talk, and then we will move to our first invited speaker. So we have 6 sessions. So 1 session on high power semiconductor laser, session 2 on vertical cavity surface emitting devices and applications, session 3, frequency comps and semiconductor laser applications, section 4 on nonlinear dynamics, session 5 on the innovative laser structures and applications, and session 6, the last one, mid-infrared quantum devices, before jumping to the closing session and to the prize for the student. Okay, so keep in mind that if you have any question, just feel free to email me using my address, or you can just use ESLW 2021. So I think we can now start the program by welcoming our keynote speaker, so Professor Ursula Keller. So I don't think I need many words to introduce her. So it's a pleasure to have Professor Keller at ESLW. Just some quick words about her career. So of course she graduated. She holds a PhD from Stanford University, and she used to work at in the technical staff of Bell Laboratories, and she started as a tenure professor at ETH Zurich in 1993, and she is very well known for her contribution on semiconductor saturable absorber mirror, of course ultra-fast laser mode locking, and she has accepted to deliver today an exceptional talk because she will review some of the gender issues and challenges she has faced over the last few decades. So we are very happy to welcome her, and I think I will give her the floor for this keynote. And then we will have, of course, I hope, some time to ask her some questions. So let's start with Professor Keller talks.
Out two buttons show gender bias. This is an unusual keynote talk at a technical conference, and I was explicitly asked to talk about the science and gender issue. Why do we have a gender topic during this keynote? I will give an update on my ultrafast laser and how it affected me as a woman and why I made these career choices. My journey in ultrafast laser started nearly 40 years ago. As a child of the 60s and 70s, I was convinced that discrimination was not an issue anymore and that I could achieve anything based on my performance. Today, I have changed my mind to explain this. And I actually think the situation can be more serious for women in leadership today. And I want to show for both men and women that when we improve on these issues, it is better for us all. Throughout this talk, I will bring examples from my own life. For people who have not read too much material on gender issues, I recommend this one paper, which is actually written by a man, even though the message may be slightly disturbing for newcomers. In this talk, I would like to address my peers. I have done just recently a talk for mentees and mentors addressing some of the same issues and certain topics, and I cannot cover here. And I would actually recommend to everybody to also see that talk. You will receive a copy of this talk, so you will have access to all the information that I'm presenting here. I studied at ETH Zurich and received a diploma in award, which is equivalent to a master. I graduated top of the class, and I achieved this outstanding result because I was motivated to win a fellowship to go abroad. In Stanford, I was meeting the first woman professor in my whole career, and actually she helped me to find the right professor for me. I could start my independent research lab right after my PhD. I became a member of technical staff, and I also benefited from some additional help for women scientists, which was based on a lawsuit from a former MTS. And I received a formal mentor, and I was also able to be part of a regular lunch meeting other women where we could exchange our experiences. Both of these programs were actually very useful for me. During all this time, I was guided and rewarded by performance, and I was able to actually turn anger based on perceived injustice into more work to show them that I can do it. And then after Bell Labs, I was recruited to ETH. There was political pressure to hire more women at ETH Zurich in Switzerland because of a Swiss national woman demonstration in 1991. I was a little bit concerned that this is actually a woman position, but Anthony Johnson and other MTS at Bell Labs encouraged me to take it, and I'm very grateful for this advice. Up to this point, practically all my role models were men. I learned from the best, and I worked goal and result oriented. As a professor at ETH, I was not anymore rewarded for performance. And I believe that I was actually sidelined by my male colleagues for pushing for success and resources like a man. But let me show you how I ended up doing all this work, coming from systems to ultimately attosecond science and frequency metrology, and what was actually the driving force behind it. When I was at Bell Labs, my initial job assignment was to really, I did. Very often, people were experts in Télécom solid-state lasers or semiconductor physics, but not very often. So the system was a very successful innovation, and so I invented this system, which is a semi. The system resolved a long-term problem, which was also when I moved to ETA, I used this invention and pushed ultrafast laser performance with this season. Initially, when I was at ETH, there was no shared clean room facility. In addition to the season mode locking scaling, I also expanded into more fundamental research as a professor. So I pushed the frontier in short pulse generation based on Thai sapphire laser. So by pushing the frontier, we reached a limit in the near infrared regime. And to go to even short pulses, we needed to go into higher frequency. This could be achieved with high harmonic generation. And so I expanded into high harmonic generation and built up an Atto line at ETH. I did a sabbatical in Lund with Anne Lullier, who was a leader in this field to learn the techniques. Basically, building it up required quite some efforts, which took some time. I needed more resources than the simple season mode locking, but luckily the Swiss National Science Foundation started new programs, which are the so-called NCCRs. So with all these efforts, I have then more than my fair share of lab space within the department. And it has been even suggested by my colleagues that I accumulated too much power. I will come back to this. By going to optosecond science and pushing the frontiers in pulse duration, we also encountered a new problem because the position of the electric field underneath the pulse envelope is actually not stabilized within a mode-locked laser. So there is arbitrary fluctuations in the position of the electric field. And if you only have a few cycles, then the position of the electric field underneath the pulse envelope changes the peak electric field, which really is a huge noise generation in high harmonic generation. Problem was actually recognized in the ultrafast laser community. It was discussed in 1995 at the Gordon conference, and it was even considered the holy grail in ultrafast laser, and everybody wanted to solve this problem. At that Gordon conference, we did not come up with a solution. We just all agreed that this is a cool goal to work for. We found the solution in collaboration with Tele in 1999, which we published, and it was very hard to receive proper credit for our work. The problem of stabilizing the electric field underneath the pulse envelope was actually solved by stabilizing the frequency cone. Solving this problem also got me into another field and another invention, because it allowed me to invent the optoclock technique. So as you can see, I have been exploring the frontiers. I have found new problems, and the problems were always opening up new research fields. So I kept expanding my research effort, and it was always motivated by cool problems and justified by excellent results. I also tried other things, which I dropped because I didn't see the success there. And so my group grew, and I required more lab space and resources, and I became a serious competition and a problem for my colleagues at ETH. Let me explain a little bit more about these optically pumped VCSELs. The motivation for optically pumped semiconductor lasers is power scaling. Because you have an external cavity, you can also put in a cesium to mode lock then this laser. So this is motivated by our work in dye-pumped solid-state lasers. We have written a review article in 2006 and then more recently in 2015 about this work. And the VCSEL really opened up the possibilities for dual cone mode locking, because the pulse repetition rate in this VCSEL is given by the external cavity. So for example, for a 3 gigahertz pulse repetition rate, you need about a 5 centimeter external cavity. So this makes it very hard to do it in a fully integrated device. So we use a diode laser to pump this VCSEL chip. And if all the parameters are set right, then you get a mode-locked pulse train out of this extended laser cavity with a pulse repetition rate given by the round-trip time of a pulse inside this cavity. By pumping a second spot on the VCSEL chip and introducing a birefringent crystal, you can actually support 2 mode-locked pulse trains with a slightly different pulse repetition rate, because in this birefringent crystal, you have a different path length for the ordinary and the extraordinary beam. So that gives you 2 mode-locked pulse trains with an adjustable difference in the pulse repetition rate. And because all the parts are shared, these pulse trains have a very good stability, which can be used for this dual cone application. So let me show that with regards to dual-com spectroscopy with this example here. So you have a gas cell here where you want to measure the optical absorption. So you take one COM from this dual-com source and let it run through the gas cells where you see the absorption as shown here. And then you use the other COM as a reference signal, which you bring into interference at a photodetector, where the beat signal between the two COMs then translates this absorption signal into the microwave COM. So this measurement goes extremely fast because it's given by the difference in the pulse repetition rate, but you need these two frequency COMs. So by taking this dual COM mixel, we could actually show that we can do it from this one laser. We didn't need any further stabilization, get the measurements done. So this was a paradigm shift in dual COM spectroscopy, because before you needed two mode-locked lasers for stabilization loops to stabilize frequency COMs in both lasers. All our earlier work was done with indium gallium arsenide gain materials operating around 1 micron. And there is, of course, a strong interest for the long wavelength regime in spectroscopy. And in 2019, I started a second ERC advanced grant pushing this technology into the long wavelength regime based gallium antimonide materials. I recently had a plenary talk to discuss about the material and design optimizations for CSEMs and these optically pumped semiconductor. And this plenary talk is actually available online under this link and gives much more details than I can cover now in this special plenary talk. With the funding of the new ERC grant, I could start a new effort with a new team. And we got already some first key milestones. We grew very high quality CSEMs. The CSEMs were so good that world record results were achieved with diapalm solid state lasers at a 2.4 micrometer, both at 250 megahertz and 2 gigahertz. We built VCSELs at 2 micron with 800 milliwatt CW output power, and we did the first mode locking without intracavity heat spreader. And in all cases, we build up the characterization for this work, and we hope we can keep pushing the results. I've had a very successful career, and all excellence markers are there. Many publication, high citation need results. I had good group size for many, many years with typically around 25 PhD students and postdoc. And by the time I'm gonna retire in 3 years, I will reach more than 100 PhD students. So how can I speak about my experience of gender bias and discrimination? In my opinion, gender issues are actually escalating for excellent women, and we need to take and present data and interviews. I will talk about a good role model from MIT, and we need to open a path for a solution with everybody engaged. So let me explain why I'm saying this. There are many challenges and barriers for progress, and these are the topics I would like to discuss with concrete examples. So let me start with the first one, hostile, unwelcoming working culture. When you look at ETH Zurich from 1855 to 2019, you can see that the number of professors has been dominated by male professors, which is shown here in gray. Only very recently, we had the first women professors. I started 1993 here. And by end of 2018-19, we had basically about 14% female full professors. and about 25% female assistant professors, even though not all of them are a 10-year track. There is political pressure to increase the women in science, which is required and justified. But the increasing number of excellent women question many established privileges for our male colleagues. And the male-dominated management culture and the informal male networks affect the current working culture. And the current working culture is not very friendly towards women. They don't feel welcome, and very often they're only tolerated with limited resources and power. It is actually well documented and also discussed in this book, which I recommend for reading, is that when women excel in her job, both male and female co-workers will remark that she may be accomplishing a lot, but is not as well liked by her peers. She's probably also too aggressive, not a team player, a bit political, and can't be trusted or difficult. In a hostile working culture, this can result in character assassination, or in German, Rufmord. Because in this case, the women do not get the normal benefit of doubt. So let me show you 3 examples, most recent 3 examples, how bad this can become for women. So these are 3 examples in Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. Professor Heike Egner, Professor Tanja Singer as a director of the Max Planck Institute, and Professor Marcella Carollo as a former colleague of mine in the physics department at ETH-CERT. All 3 women had an excellent performance track record, and they all were terminated. The accusation was significant misconduct in management and inappropriate leadership. The accusers remained anonymous, and the allegations were aimed at their personal integrity. And the poor governance without independent grievance processes were responsible for the escalation. In this management magazine published in 2020, these cases were compared, and a German politician commented in this article, this is a career risk, especially for women. So why do we have this escalation of hostility against women? And this is partially triggered by the political pressure to hire more women. This partially results from the perceived feeling of injustice and the feeling of reverse discrimination of many male colleagues. So reverse discrimination means that now white males are discriminated in the selection process for a professor position, for example. I believe that there is a lack of understanding of the current gender issues and the problems, and we need a broader education, because I don't think that this reverse discrimination is true. Actually, there are facts that show that this is not true. But it is important to realize that in the beginning, equal treatment may feel like reverse discrimination, but it's not, because for the longest time, the men were just within their own group. And now, with the political pressure, these women are coming. But at this point, women are still a small minority, and the growth is still smaller than with the male colleagues. So an example how you can do a broader education is actually shown in the UK with this Juno type project, especially geared for the physics department, and you find the link here. So let me go to my case in the physics department. As a reminder again, I was hired in 1992 into a 10-year professor position within the Institute of Quantum Electronics, which is part of the physics department. I started in March 1993, and remember, I was actually a quota woman, even though at that time there was no official quota effort in Switzerland. But still, the Swiss National Women Demonstration in 1991 increased the political pressure, and I was actually approached for a direct hire when I was still at Bell Labs into this woman position, and I took it. I became the first 10-year woman professor in physics at ETH. And I started off with significantly less resources than average in the Institute at that time. There was actually no transparency of the resource distribution within the department. I just realized that later on. I had the written promise for more with good performance and the retirement of all the professors, which I thought at that time was a good deal because I was always rewarded for good performance. So I thought, no problem, I will show. And I also got a promise that there will be a daycare in case I will consider having children. And when I showed up, I was pretty much ignored by my male colleagues. I had some help from Professor Melchior, but he became more and more disgruntled because at the end, he was the only one to give me more space, and that was really hurting him. But at least I really did not need the help of the physics department because I was pretty well prepared by my independent research at Bell Labs for 4 years. And again, I just focused on performance and results. After I was hired, we had also an additional professor hired as an assistant professor. But then for 22 years, all the professor selection committees resulted in hiring a male professor with 24-0. On the level of the permanent senior scientist, the ratio was 33-1. Only through dual career appointment, we actually increased the number of tenure professors by one, Marcella Carollo. 2017, Professor Simon Lilly became department head. He is the husband of Marcella Carollo and initiated an emergency program to appoint female tenure track faculty, because by then it became clear that, as the senior professors were coming closer and closer to retirement, there will be soon no women left in the physics department. 2019, the department had a crisis and Professor Carollo was terminated. This Carollo case was very controversially discussed in the media and is currently at the Swiss Federal Administrative Court. But because of this crisis, the department was convinced to do something, and within 2 years, we hired 5 tenure-track women assistant professors. And some people were even surprised how excellent the candidates were. So let me address the next point, family and care commitments. Let me first start with my case. When I got pregnant in 1996, my promotion from associate to full professor was actually interrupted. And I was questioned if I could do my job with children. It resulted in a big mess within the physics department. I got some help from some people and there was quite a dispute about this. But finally, after 4.5 years after my start as an associate professor, I was promoted to a full professor. And when I compare myself to my peers, at that time, all of them male, they were promoted after 3 years and all had young children and all of them had no problem in their promotion. I definitely believe you can do a career and have children. We've done it. I've done it with my husband. This is a picture from my family with my 2 kids. But you need special measures because having children is not business as usual. You need reliable daycare and you need additional support in case of sickness and when you have important work deadlines and all these kind of things. And the woman really needs to focus on the essential task and receive additional help during this baby phase because you cannot work 150 to 200% in this phase. But this can be managed and there are many examples listed here. I have no doubt that this can be managed if the leadership wants to do it. Let me go to the next point. You also need resources to be successful, and you need to have access to resources based on some defined excellence criteria and performance. In my case, unfortunately, my field of research, it was really resource heavy. So I really pushed the limit within the physics department. I'm really convinced if you have limited transparency and accountability with regards to resource distribution, you actually waste resources and it hurts the science community in general. And of course, the minorities are hurt much more by bad governance. Again, going back to my case, when I was hired in 1992, I was actually promised in writing in my employment contract that I will get more resources with good performance and when needed. After my promotion dispute, I was actually marginalized within the physics department. I was considered a troublemaker. I had no space increase, no info, no leadership position, and I was personally threatened, losing goodwill with the head of the institute. It took me about 10 years to have a comparable level of space as newly hired colleagues after me from the start. So let me show the data. This is the number of PhD students and postdocs over the years in red here, growing ever since the start of my hire. And in blue, you have the total space that I received. As you can see, I received about half of the space of my colleagues when they started. And of course, the older generation of professors even had more. The lines here are the moments when my two kids were born, and you can see that I had a plateau in the number of people and in the space. And here I started the new effort in attosecond science, and I have been fighting for more space, which I finally got. But you can see that even though the number of people have been growing, my total space did not increase. And so I had to give up office space to accommodate for the lab space to simply be able to do my job. It actually even pushed me into a regime where I did a sabbatical here at UC Berkeley, where I seriously considered leaving ETH. I was losing goodwill from the ETH president also, because after the birth of my first child, during this whole battle with the promotion, I lost the goodwill in my department. And then I had a second kid, and the president changed, and I had again problems with access to ETH daycare. And I asked the new president for help, because the first one promised me the space and really helped me. But the new president did not consider this necessary. The new president was also not supportive of my request for more resources. He even went as far as telling me that I should keep quiet. In a meeting where I was hoping I would get help from him, together with my husband, he told me I should keep quiet or else I will lose his goodwill, the goodwill of the full leadership of ETH and many other people in Switzerland. He even repeated this several times because I just was sitting there and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the first time in my life I was actually really scared. I mean, I had two young children. My husband just started a company. We actually relied on me being the responsible person for the family income. This was in principle against the law of equal rights in Switzerland, but there was nowhere to go and ask for help. The legal grievance processes takes many years and costs around 300 to 500,000 Swiss francs, which you have to pay on your own as an individual, and pretty much kills your career. In 1999, after this threat, because I have this strong sense of just a hard time to cope with this. I really considered leaving after all. But then there was a rescue from MIT. It was about during the same time period. There were senior women professors at MIT. They got organized and reported about discrimination in resource distribution and culture to the president. And the MIT president started a more detailed survey. At the end, an MIT report was published in 1999, acknowledging gender discrimination, and MIT announced additional measures. One sentence here really resonated with me, where the president said, "However, I sat bolt upright in my chair when a senior woman who has felt unfairly treated for some time said, I also felt very positive." Reading this report really helped me. Basically, it took me to academia. I realized I'm not alone, and it's not my fault that I did not feel welcome in my department. And so I was just determined to keep going and focus on my success with the hope that hopefully one day I will be treated with respect. In hindsight, I was lucky that I started my career in applied research, because season mode locking was a success story with real customers, not just the peers. It had a high impact with large industrial relevance and a high citation record. Basically, building a laser is a measurable result which reduces the gender bias in peer review. I will come back to this because in principle, you know, if you build a better laser, it doesn't matter if it's done by a woman or a man. And the good funding that we had with the high acceptance rate actually also helped in the gender bias. Because at the beginning, at that time in the National Science Foundation in Switzerland, the acceptance rate for individual grants were 80 to 50%. So at the end, I can really say photons do not show gender bias. If you build a better laser, measure better power, shorter pulses, it doesn't matter who built this laser. Let me explain this bias in peer review and also the grievance process. So I'll use these two examples. This is an important slide from the Swiss National Science Foundation, which clearly shows that peer review is not gender blind. Let me explain this. This is a mean score for a proposal by a reviewer. And this is the result of 40,000 reviewers in project funding. And here is the gender of the reviewer. And red is the results of the mean scores for female proposals and blue for the male proposals. So what you can see, both women and men are rating females' proposals lower. The only difference is that the gap between the male and the female proposals is smaller with the women, but not by much. And so if you have a really small acceptance rate, this small difference in the mean score can really hurt your success rate for funding. Solution for such problems is that you can get the gender data first in the reviewing. You have to have well-defined evaluation criteria and reduce the conflict of interest in peer review. At the end, this becomes easier with more women proposal. You can actually make a correction of the scores for the gender bias. You can also limit the number of funded grants per PI because that increases the acceptance rate. So let me give you another example out of my history, which is actually relevant for today, about the grievance processes. For example, in 2006, I was declared incompetent in attosecond science by my colleagues. I received a written letter from the director of the NZCR, where I got the funding to start the attosecond science, to stop funding because the postdoc is leaving, because the project was jeopardized. This is the situation in 2006. What is different compared to my colleagues? Postdocs are normally coming and going. This is business as usual for a professor. Every professor is expected to be competent to organize personnel. And I did not know a single case of a male professor who was told to stop spending money because a postdoc was leaving. And I received this letter even without ever anybody talking to me. This was definitely not business as usual, and especially not with my track record. I had no apologies, and ultimately funding was cut in the next phase of the NZZR. You know, the fact was that an overly ambitious postdoc could convince my colleagues that I do not understand anything about physics, and it is best to transfer part of my lab to his new lab because he was awarded an independent professor position. My key success after the postdoc left in 2006 was the invention of the upper clock in 2008, for which I received my first ERC grant. Why did I survive? The postdoc actually made a mistake. He treated my PhD students very badly. HR investigations, based on the request of the PhD student and myself, resulted in a very poor evaluation for the postdoc. And this report from Human Resources was also shared with the department, and the department head at that time helped after he read this report. Mostly motivated to protect the students, not mainly me. And at that time, a professor position was still quite a power position, and the professors were in principle well protected. But similar situations happen to women even today, more than 10 years later. It's very similar to this case, but with much worse outcomes, because these overly ambitious postdocs also learned from each other how to do this. We need additional measures and political leadership pressure for a culture change. When I stepped up to a leadership position and became a director of the NZZR MAST, I also was empowered with resources to do something for the advancement of women. I hired one person, Dr. Anna Gary, to help me with this effort. And we started a new column with the OSA magazine together with Professor Anthony Johnson. Remember, he's the one who encouraged me to take the woman position at ETH on reflections on diversity. And before the first column was published, I also published an OSA viewpoint in February 2011. I basically wrote, at this point in my career, on the respect of my colleagues, I have put in the work to establish a long career. If I, as a senior female science professor, cannot speak up strongly for change, who can? These National Center of Competence in Switzerland are long-term research efforts with quite a lot of funding. The goal is to empower a new or old research structure. So we came up with a FAST lab as a new shared ultrafast laser technology platform. Then we should demonstrate education on an industrial outreach and advancement of women and equal opportunity. When I took this leadership, I was the first woman director of any NZZR in Switzerland, and we did it in a co-leading approach. I shared the leadership with Professor Thomas Feurer at the University of Bern. As a director, you receive additional resources when you take over this leadership. This was actually essential for maintaining both the season mode locking and the after-second science. And we received excellent reviews for our management and PI satisfaction, and our advancement for women effort were considered an outstanding role model for all NZZRs. One outcome of our efforts was, for example, the creation of the Women Professor Forum. This was, of course, motivated by the the previous 2 years at ETH Zurich. Male-dominated management culture and predominance of men in numbers and in leadership positions affected women proportionally. Not sufficient accountability and transparency with regards to resource and space allocation, committee work, teaching load, and most importantly, the decision-making process was considered a real issue. Then the grievance processes were considered generally not good by both men and women, but for women in particular, rated the complaints process for discrimination as rather negative to very negative. And also the duration of the grievance process is a source of undue stress, and the substantial financial burden that goes into this also gives strong indication for academic mobbing. The conflict with the professor involved in the process was a real issue because very often retired professors with their informal network actually were part or were leading the grievance processes. And there was a lack of protection of professors from frivolous accusations. And I'll give you examples of what that really means. Here are the links for these the reviews which are published. I consider especially the EPFL report as very useful because that was based on real interviews, so you have a little bit more information. The published report is a little bit whitewashed, but there is actually a more detailed report for internal use at EPFL. Unfortunately, it's confidential. I actually think there is a lot of learning material that would help the broader community to better understand the problems. The role model MIT was published in 1999. And so we now also had published reports more than 20 years later. But the current challenge with the leadership at many European universities and institutions is that the leadership is more concerned about the potential reputational damage rather than fixing the problem. The example of MIT actually showed that there was no reputational damage. MIT is still #1. In the contrary, with this reaction of the president at that time, it made MIT look strong. And the president received a lot of respect for his reaction, and it changed the culture for many women. I'm very concerned that our current leadership tends to use their power to keep women quiet and even punish women who dare to stand up for change. In my case, I stepped up for a culture change ever since I became a director of NCTR MAST. I also received the additional resources to do this. And I was stepping up in protection for many women and some male professor colleagues suffering from escalating problematic grievance processes ever since 2017. The Carollo case was the first one. This resulted in personal penalties for me within ETH. Let me give you examples of bad working culture for women. Women and outsider groups often have lower mistake tolerance and are punished more strongly for them. And the lack of independent grievance procedures, minor mistake, or even made up issues become weaponized, totally blown out of proportions. I've seen so many of my male colleagues doing much worse and never were punished as much as I have seen women punished. So this supports a management culture of intimidation. Unequal treatment, depending on how many friends one has in leadership, this does not support excellent and wastes resources. And it has also affected male professors. It did not just happen with women, but bad governance always hurts the underrepresented group first. I really like this quote by Albert Einstein: "A person who never made a mistake never tried anything new." You know, I never seen a perfect manager. It would be nice if this also applies for women scientists. Examples of a hostile culture and a culture of intimidation is when disgruntled group member become weaponized to hurt a woman, or administrative investigation, or scientific misconduct accusation. And when women are actually punished when they stand up for change or in protection for other women. Weaponizing a disgruntled group member already started with the Carola case in 2017, but that case was only one out of many. Within our Women Professor Forum network, we heard of many other cases where disgruntled or frustrated PhD student or overly ambitious postdoc have been used to increase pressure on unwanted professors. This happened to both senior women and young assistant professors. And these undesirable, unwanted professors become mobbing target by colleagues and even the leadership of the university because of these informal networks. This also can happen to male colleagues. This is something to remember. An example, as summarized by a medical doctor, is shown here. This is translated into English.
I was intrigued by the succession of women professors of the same profile coming to consult me for the same reasons. For a state of physical and mental exhaustion linked to a work environment that is both hostile and threatening to them. They describe a climate in which the slightest action on their part triggers an investigation. They are then asked to justify themselves on a whole series of points. These strangely repetitive investigations endanger their academic careers. That such ambitious women are arriving in a state of health for my consultation both dismays and worries me. It is not a distress that can be explained by the psychology of the specific individual. It is indeed a small epidemic in an internationally recognized school. I find this both sad and disillusioning.
These repetitive investigations are very often based on so-called administrative investigations. These administrative investigations are normally used to collect facts. However, many of these investigations have been used as an effective disciplinary investigation against certain professors. And these administrative investigations actually limit the rights of an individual under investigation, the target, in comparison to a real disciplinary investigation. And the large power and economic mismatch between the university and the individual is also indicative of mobbing the target. Examples are shown here. These are published examples. I have personally experienced such investigations both as a witness and a target, and I'm happy to answer questions to all of them. In my case, when I was a target, which is the so-called BDO administrative investigation, this was happening at the same time with an official investigation from the Eidgenössische Finanzkontrolle, so it's the Swiss Federal Finance Control. That report actually was in disagreement, partial disagreement with the BDO, and that actually really saved me in hindsight. If all these investigations didn't help yet to have this unwanted professor leaving, then very often the pressure was increased with additional scientific misconduct accusation. Because these unwanted professors are pressured to leave the university or even sign a non-disclosure agreement. And these additional attempts of scientific misconduct was really used to increase the pressure so that they're finally leaving. And that happened both at ETH and at EPFL. And actually, we know cases at other European universities and institutes. Let me go back to the example of Marcella Carollo, which I know pretty well. Marcella was accused by some group member about some image manipulation. The figure in question was never published and was simply used to illustrate a well-known fact. A formal investigation was started after a while, and a preliminary evaluation by the confidant, which is not an independent person in this process, it's a retired professor, resulted actually in more charges with regards to a possible scientific misconduct. So this confidant now also became an accuser. The start of this formal investigation was actually publicly announced under this link, and that this formal investigation is justified based on the preliminary results. This additional escalation in the grievance process was used to relieve her of all the duties. All people in her group were removed from her. By this point, character assassination, Rufmord, was accomplished. There was no need for this public announcement in principle, and actually hurts the person very strongly. And then there was no need to speed up the clarification of the accusation, because Professor Carollo received never the detailed information so that she could actually defend herself, because discussing authorship requires actually to identify the paper in question. Only after 10 months, she received the necessary details of accusation, and she was asked to respond to all of those accusations within 11 days. No possible extensions. She did it. A detailed 70-page response was submitted on time by Professor Carollo. After about 1 year, the investigation committee submitted to ETH leadership there had been no scientific misconduct. And Professor Marcella Carollo was still at ETH. And at that point, the ETH president requested to terminate Professor Carollo in ETH News in March 2019. I really would recommend this book. In this book, it is also shown that many highly educated and talented women are opting out of their careers because they are rejecting the workplace. Actually, there is a 2017 Forbes report which showed that women leave the tech field at a rate that is 45% higher than men. These are all lost opportunities and is hurting us all. Unfortunately, when women actively promote other women, they often face career penalties. Not even white male executives receive any career-related advantage for actually working to create diversity. So let me go back to my case. I experienced increased academic mobbing after 2017. I watched my only senior woman professor colleague, Marcella Carollo, being fired, and I tried for 2 years with ETH internal efforts to help her. And then finally, I accepted a public interview, which was published in 2019. I lost more goodwill with the current leadership, and I also received an official first notice before termination in 2019. I'm actually also on federal court with this case. I also was exposed to ETH internal investigations. My finances were investigated over 10 years. I became a target of an administrative investigation. There were attempted accusations of scientific misconduct. There are attempts to cancel research funding, both ETH internally and Swiss National Science Foundation. And as you remember, when I started my directorship 2010, and in my viewpoint article, I wrote 2011, if I, as a senior female science professor, cannot speak up strongly for change, who can? I still want to ask that question. If this all would have happened in the middle of my career, it pretty much would have killed my career. There are books written about these issues. I read both of them, and I can highly recommend them. Can we solve these challenges? I believed it in 2010, and I still believe it now. Let me give a few enabling steps in my final view graph. What steps can we do to improve the current situation? First of all, we need independent checks and independent grievance procedures for sufficient oversight and ultimate credibility in the existing university culture. We need to continue to increase the number of women using special measure as needed. The target should be more than 30% because that has been shown that by then the women have a chance to affect the working culture. We need more efforts on retention, performance, promotion, and culture change. These additional efforts to achieve real culture change need structures and real benefits, rather than negative feedback for engaging on this for both men and women. We also need to increase the motivation. There could be access to more funding with better governance. And the better governance is important to weaken these informal networks, which happen to be mostly male at this point. These networks, when unchecked, tend to hurt overall excellence, waste resources, and hurt the scientific community in general. For the benefit of us all and good science, we need more help from our male colleagues, because when we manage to introduce this better governance, this will also help the men and it will help science. When we try harder, we can actually do better. You know, for 22 years, every selection committee in my department selected a man with 24-0. And within 2 years, we found 5 excellent tenure track women assistants. So the women are there. We just need to hire them. But this requires a real commitment from our leadership with measurable results. These are not expensive measures, and this will benefit everybody. So I hope I could give a more detailed explanation why the situation is severe. And I hope that we can engage everybody for a solution. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor Keller, for this very exciting talk. I will switch off. Yes, so just we had some issue during the Zoom, but so I apologize for that. And the talk will be available for everybody on YouTube after the conference. So we may have time for a couple of questions to Professor Keller. So is there any question in the audience? Please feel free to interact. I have a general question, maybe something. So do you think there is still there still exists some typical stereotypes that science are not for women? And if there is still one, do you think that can be changed? How can you change a stereotype?
Of course, there is still the stereotype today, but we have more and more women coming in. And because of the hostile environment, which is the increased competition from these excellent women, these are all highly motivated women, right? We are actually keeping the final number low, and these are role models, and that would give a positive feedback. So by keeping these women in, by creating better governance, we actually will have more role models, and hopefully we have a working culture that works for all.
Okay. Now, Angela, I see you have a question.
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. It is wonderful and terrible at the same time. And you said that it is required to motivate women, but also we need laws for doing that. Because, for example, in Italy, it is impossible to have a position in the university dedicated only for women, because this is a discrimination. So we cannot have a specific call for a woman position because it is forbidden by our law. So this means that the law must change as well. Otherwise, in Italy, it is impossible to have a position like yours when you started.
Yes, this is a real issue, because when you look at MIT, the only increase of women in the science faculty only occurred with affirmative action. Every time it was the normal free selection, it was flat. And actually, Italy produces a lot of excellent women for the whole world, because they have 50% at the end with a PhD or something like this. And I know of many excellent Italian colleagues who are now professors all over the world. And I think Italy needs to change the law, because this is the only way to get more women in.
I see two other questions. So please feel free. Yes, go ahead.
I don't know. It's me. Okay. Yeah, it was an excellent talk and shocking in the same time. But you say one has to change the culture, but culture has a long history in the different countries. And from your experience in US and in Europe, at least in some European countries, maybe Switzerland, Germany, are there some basic differences and maybe also solutions already, or maybe trends in improving of the culture, because it's not only our community, it's always the whole society.
Yes, this is correct. That change of culture is typically pushed away by saying, oh, this is a problem of the society. But actually in the UK, they build up these programs, which is connected to funding. And if you look at the Juno project and so on, so universities, departments had to qualify with certain governance changes to even receive funding. And it really changed the culture. So I know of a former postdoc of mine who became a professor in the UK, and she said, these programs really changed the culture. You know, it's actually not only the culture and the unconscious bias. It is about competition. And when you look in school, in the Matura level, the women are just as good as the men, you know, but then afterwards, they're supposedly not good enough anymore. No, no, no. So I actually think, you know, a lot of my colleagues fearing the competition, and, you know, some of them will not get a professor position anymore because there are these excellent women coming. So if you just think from defending your goals and your chances, it is easier to make the culture hostile. You get rid of 50% of your competition and your chance go up. So it is not just unconscious.
Okay.
Angela, you have another question, or?
No, it's just because I'm not able to unraise my hand.
Okay. So is there some other question in the audience?
I have one request, read this one paper by one of your male colleagues. It's a very short paper. You can read it before you go to sleep.
I see one more question from Gael, so you can ask Gael if you want.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ursula, for this talk, which is really, both as said before, shocking, but also help people understand, I think, what you may have lived and the reality of the situation. I could notice that you discussed a lot about improving the governance, but you did not mention so much about mentoring younger female scientists or PhD students, or even some promotion of female PhDs, or what about dedicated fundings for female PhD only, for example? So I was wondering about that kind of mentorship and helping youngers to get having better chance of winning this competition.
This is a very excellent question. And of course, you know, I already gave a very long talk, as you know, just to explain my colleagues that there is a real issue. And I would like to refer to this other talk I mentioned at the beginning that I gave to mentors and mentees. And there I actually propagated the sisterhood concept, so that the women, we're having now an increased number of women. So the women need to also be active and help each other. And, you know, the power of men is also based on dividing the women very good. So they always need a few women to play ball to keep the other ones down. And these few women get rewarded really well. So there's a pretty complex system going on, guys, and it's about power and resources and more competition. And I try to explain to the young women how to cope in this one, and I've done it personally. And you need to have a little bit of concept how to survive a hostile environment without taking it too personally. You know, I'm still a happy person, right? I don't need to feel sorry for myself, you know.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there one more question? No.
Great.
So I think we can thank Professor Keller for this nice talk, and I think you really you share with us your experience on discrimination and gender issues. So it was very, very interesting. So thank you very much for giving this keynote talk. And I think now we can move to the first invited speaker. We are still staying in Switzerland and in the Zurich area. We just go now to with Dr. Mosselen from IBM Research in the suburbs of Zurich. And so she's gonna talk about materials integration and nanoscale devices. 3.5 nanophotonics devices monolithically integrated on silicon. She is working in the material integration and nanoscale devices group. So Kirsten, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, is this the right setting mode, or shall I swap the?
I think you are not full screen, but
okay.
But
now it's better.
Yeah, now it's good. Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. And I must also say it's very hard to take the floor right now after such a distinguished speaker and such a heart-reaching talk, I would say. But what I'm going to talk about today is actually not high power lasers. We're going to really go back to
recording in progress.
Really going to go back and look more at some of the materials aspects, because this is what we're working on. So as you mentioned, this is work that's done at the Materials Integration Nanoscale Devices Group at IBM Research in Zurich. So we are not too far from the ETH, but still more across the industrial environment. So for this reason, I could say about our work, we are really focused. IBM is a semiconductor company, or at least we were a semiconductor company. So we're really focused on staying on a silicon platform, because that's the established technology for electronics. Silicon is cheap, it's abundant, it's self-passivating, and it has a very convenient band gap. It's not too large, not too small. However, for some applications, it's a problem as indirect. So it's not very good for light sources. It's less efficient for detectors. And for this reason, we're working with 3.5 semiconductors, direct and tunable band gap. They have high capabilities. They can also reach high absorption coefficients, especially in the near ER. That's interesting for telecom and datacom. However, of course, this is of course not so easy. Just gonna move this box so that you don't see it. because you cannot just grow 3.5 directly on silicon. This is going to lead to several problems because first of all, you have a lattice mismatch in between the crystal lattices of the two. This can range from about 4% to 19%. In addition to this, you have large polarity and thermal expansion coefficient mismatch. That means if you're growing materials, even if it works fine, let's say it's 600 degrees for your growth, once you take your wafers out, you would get cracks and defects. So what I will focus on today is actually an integration technique, which we developed at IBM almost a decade ago. And the work we've been doing on this, we call it template-assisted selective epitaxy, or TASE, which basically enables the integration of 3.5 really locally. So it's nanostructures with low dislocation densities. So as I mentioned before, we started this almost a decade ago. And if you see here, so I'll just make this my cursor. Yeah. A laser pointer here. On the top part here, you will see the epitaxial growth we developed, and down here, the applications. So in the beginning, at that point, we actually working on traditional BLS type growth of nanowires, and we had some, I wouldn't say issues, but there were some limitations if you want to go to advanced devices, because you do not get so sharp junctions. You also have issues with overgrowth of your junctions, which can be good in some cases for core shell applications, but it's sort of limiting. So we're looking for new ways to grow our materials. So the first was these heterostructure devices, vertical nanowires. Then we're also expanding into platelets. These are especially interesting for high performance FinFETs and RF devices. Looking at arbitrary shapes, because when you're dealing with nanostructures, one of the hard things is that usually they're so small, so it can be really hard to just put contacts to measure things like hole mobility to get basic material properties out. We also worked on the integration of different 3.5s. And lastly here, we're focusing more on really controlling the growth, so controlling crystal faces, in particular getting water-tight 3.5s, because that's interesting also in photonic applications for covering the green gap of LEDs. And we developed this SIPA-ELO technique that allows you to grow some very specific structures with a high degree of control. I want to make a disclaimer here. These last two works is not on silicon, it's on indium phosphide, because here we're really working with fine tuning of the growth, and it's just easier when you're on a 3.5 platform. If we look at device applications, initially we were more concerned by electronic applications, because this is just what we're working on at that point in time. So we work with TFETs, high performance MOSFET, also the 3D stacking of 3.5s on top of silicon, also looking at some quantum devices and ballistic transport. And more recently, we've been focusing on some of the photonic applications, because of course, if you have experience and you're used to growing and contacting these devices, there's a lot of things you can also do for photonics. And we started out with this sort of more crude nano microdisc lasers, also growing these sort of platelet structures. And more recently, are focusing on other monolithic in-gas and heterostructure detectors that can go to high speeds, 50 or 70 gigahertz, and directly integrated with silicon, as well as micro lasers. So either these photonic or hybrid silicon 3.5 photonic crystal lasers, or these microdiscs. And since this is a semiconductor laser workshop, I've chosen to just talk about these two applications, but you're welcome to ask questions. And if you're interested, you can follow up on our other work as well. So here's just an overview of this presentation. First, I'll give you a general introduction to template-assisted selective epitaxy. As this is something we've been doing for almost 10 years, we have many different embodiments, and depending on the application, sometimes we go vertical, sometimes lateral. Also, it's a little bit different maybe for electronics and photonics. But I'm going to focus on two different embodiments here, either these microdisc lasers or these sort of in-plane structures on SOI. Then I'll present first the hybrid 3.5 silicon photonic crystal lasers, then move on to these monolithic 3.5 microdisc lasers, and then discuss some issues with cavity scaling, where we use metals to either completely metal clad the lasers, or also micro or nano antenna to improve the wavelength selectivity. I just want to make a disclaimer here. I might call some of these lasers, but as you probably know, in many nano laser structures, it can be very hard to really prove that you have lasing. So what we're doing, we look at both, of course, in light in, light out curves. Some cases we do see a clear threshold, others not. We also looking at line width narrowing, as well as lifetimes to see and establish if we see a difference. We do not do G2 measurements, so we cannot establish without a doubt that we have lasing in these structures. Normally we refer to them as resonant emission, but I just want to mention this in the beginning. So now we go back to the template-assisted selective epitaxy, so our epitaxial techniques. And of course, we are not the only ones working on 3.5 and silicon integration. There's a large community of people and groups all over the world. I have a box here in the middle of my screen. I'm just moving this. So, looking at this, most conventional, this is done by wafer bonding. Either in this case, the work from IMEC Ghent, where they use sort of PCB bonding to bond quantum well structures that are grown by MBE on a lattice match substrate, because generally you get higher material quality. We also work in our group with these sort of more advanced devices where we do wafer bonding and then a 3.5 material on top of a silicon photonics platform. And there's pick and place techniques where you basically can create your, in this case, it's a 2D photonic crystal from MTT, and then you can grow your 3.5 nanostructures on another substrate and then do pick and place of these. So if you're looking at 3.5 epitaxy on silicon photonics, there are really a plethora of different techniques. Wafer bonding is the most established, and this is an excellent technique. It's really, if you want to bring 3.5s all over your wafer, it's the best technique because you get this high material quality because you can grow completely lattice matched. On a sacrificial substrate, you transfer it onto your carrier wafer, and then you fabricate devices. So we actually do probably half the work in our group. We're working on conventional wafer bonding. And for many applications, this is really the way to go. However, if you're looking at applications for nanoscale structures where you really want to have a local integration, then it's a bit limited. Then there's planar epitaxy. People have been doing this for more than half a century. And this is the most, let's say, straightforward way of getting 3.5s all over your silicon wafer. So there's no discrepancy in the wafer size. For 3.5 wafers are much smaller generally than silicon wafers. So for commercial applications, this can be a limitation. So this is monolithic. However, as you can see, these are just some examples. You might get some material defects. Of course, you can have these defect stopping layers and grow, and eventually you have a high material quality. But even so, there can be topography because you need at least a couple of 100 nanometers of buffer layer before you get to your high quality material. For this reason, I guess there's a lot of people working on selective epitaxy technique. There's aspect ratio trapping, or ART, which has become very, very popular, where you basically grow your 3.5 material within these trenches. So you will get dislocations because of a lattice mismatch, but you rely on sort of these defects terminating on the sidewalls of the trenches. And eventually you go out here and you can have very high material quality. If you combine it with CMP and different regrowth techniques, you can also get quantum wells, like in this case. And there are different sort of additions to this technique, so you can really try and tune it very well. So in terms of standalone applications, there are great devices demonstrated with both ART as well as nanowire growth. So this is an example from TU Munich, where they grow the nanowires on top of silicon with some isolation here in between, and you can then grow these core shell nanowires where you can get very good sort of nanolaser performance. However, in both cases, I would say it's scalable. You don't need to thick buffers, but the geometry may also be limiting in terms of really looking at very different types of devices. So basically, this is all these considerations, and we're working on both wafer bonding, nanowires, and so. But this is what led us to really look at TACE for devices, because we have more flexibility. So this is an illustration how it works on SOI. We basically start out by patterning the silicon structures we would like to have. In this case, it's just a simple rod, but it can be anything. This goes for both the silicon passives as well as for the silicon we would like to replace by 3.5. We cover everything in an oxide, then open one extremity of the oxide here, and then we can etch away sacrificially the silicon we'd like to replace by 3.5. And then we're growing the 3.5 basically within this confined oxide cavity. And the important part here is that only a small area here is exposed at the silicon, then you can afterwards expand your growth and grow larger platelets. So it's similar to nanowire growth in the way that if you keep your nucleation steel small, let's say on the order of 100 nanometers roughly, then you avoid any dislocations and you only get local defects that terminate within a few nanometers here. Then afterwards, we've grown the structures. You can either keep them as they are, you can strip the oxide depending on if we're making a transistor or the type of device, and then we contact them as usual. And also, as you can see here, this enables us to get in-plane junctions, both homojunctions. We have doping as well as heterostructures, and that's different than, for example, MBE techniques, where you can get very high quality material, but you're always growing sort of in the vertical direction. We've also demonstrated we can use this to integrate multiple 3.5s on the same wafer. So we're basically repeating the process. In this case, just as a demonstrator, we grew first indium arsenide in one channel here, then covered it up, opened the neighboring channel here where we grew gallium antimonide. And so in this way, you can get really alternating, as many times as you want to repeat your growth, but structures of different 3.5s completely independently optimized. And you can put these as close together as your lithography can make it. In this, I can mention we use indium arsenide and gallium antimonide because these are actually candidates for complementary 3.5 CMOS logic. But you can imagine for photonic applications, there are many different material combinations that will work. So this was just introducing the technique we're working with here. So now I'll talk about the first type of devices. So I'm sure you're all familiar with photonic crystal cavities. They're very interesting for integrated photonics because you can get ultra high Q factors, you have small mode volumes, you can make very high performance, especially in terms of low power and high modulation speed emitters in this way. However, most of the photonic crystal devices around are these sort of 2D membrane features or structures here. And one of the issues is that you can have issues with removal of your heat you generate in your devices. And also if you use the same, say, an MBE grown layer where your quantum well extends into the mirrors, you will also get increased absorption, which will mean an increase in threshold. So the number of groups working around this. So this is the work from Institut, where they have this selective growth of the active region with quantum wells only in the core cavity. Similar work here from DTU. They're doing a slightly different process, but the same technique, and basically both aim at just isolating your gain material to your central cavity. A similar approach is used here, but let's say, or a similar idea is behind this, where they have a silicon photonic crystal membrane here, and then locally place a 3.5 gain material. So there are ways you can do this. So we are using another approach. So here we are looking at 1D photonic crystal beams, where you have basically these rod structures. This is because it's more, it's easier to couple directly to the waveguides we're working on. It's also more an embedded approach. This works with what we're doing well. And so what we are doing is we design the whole structure in silicon, we etch it in silicon. This also has advantages. The silicon is generally much nicer to etch than 3.5s, especially 3.5s with different composition. You can get smooth sidewalls and they're easily passivated. And then afterwards we will place, I'll show you next, the 3.5 centers here in the core of the cavity only, so we can avoid absorption here, at least if we pick the right 3.5 in the mirrors. It also means that we're actually using existing photonic crystal designs that are made by silicon, because sometimes making a completely new photonic crystal design can be quite time consuming. So the way we do this is similar to what I showed before, so I'm going to go a bit fast. So we basically etch out the entire silicon photonic crystal structure. Also, in some cases, you can include waveguides, you can modify the reflectivity on both sides. Covered in oxide, and open here window. Oh, my cursor is moving around. And then etch away the central part here of the silicon seeds in the middle. You can make this any number you like, 1, 3, 5. Sometimes we do the whole thing. And then regrow the 3.5 in the central region. So this is the way it looks afterwards. So this is a top view of one such structures. I would make a small disclaimer here. You can see the length of these rods is not exactly the same. And that was just because at that time when we grew these samples, we had an issue with some oxygen contamination in our MOCVD. And this sort of can make it harder to tune your nucleation correctly. So this leads again to a small variation in the length of the rod. So this is not inherent to the method. In general, it's very well controlled. Nevertheless, despite that we have this non-uniformity, we actually see very stable devices and very well controlled emission here. So if you do a cross section and look at the crystal facets, we can see we have an epitaxial relationship to silicon. We can also see that they're monocrystalline devices here. So this is just, we continue to work on this. So this is just to show that we can actually remove the silicon seeds very efficiently by xenon difluoride etching. So you stop exactly at the 3.5 rods. And then we also have devices where we create this sort of, by HHQ, it turns into oxide, this additional waveguiding structure on top that also sort of stabilizes the device. So the first devices we make had just indium phosphide here in the central region, and indium phosphide is emitting around 850, 900 nanometers wavelengths, where silicon also absorbs. So we only saw resonant emission at 130 Kelvin for those devices. And our more recent batch, actually, we grew in here a heterostructure. So we started out with indium phosphide, then indium gallium arsenide, and end up with indium phosphide. So you get additional confinement here in the central region via the, let's say, the band gap. The InGaAs has a smaller band gap than the indium phosphide. And here we see resonant emission at 300 Kelvin, as I'm showing here. So that's those sandwich devices. So they're optically pumped devices. As is well known from photonic crystal in general, is that by tuning the lattice constant, you can really shift the emission over the entire telecom band, as is shown here. As I mentioned in the beginning, in some of these devices, we do not see that, say, that clear threshold. This is the light in, light out curves, but we do see band gap narrowing, and also we can distinguish the diffraction pattern for those devices. So we see what we say evidence of lasing or resonant emission at 300 Kelvin from those structures, despite the fact that we really had a, let's say, non-perfect geometry. They were actually quite stable. So I will switch here to the next topic. These are 3.5 microdisc lasers. So these are sort of mushroom type lasers directly grown in silicon. And this is a slide. We've also modified the process here compared to the first device. We just grew the 3.5 directly. Now we're actually starting slightly different, where we first etch out these sort of silicon nanopillars. And this is just because it makes some issues with nucleation and say, planarization easier. So we make this silicon nanopillar structure, cover it with oxide, planarize it by CMP, use a sacrificial material, in this case the amorphous silicon, and create this sort of hollow cavity on top of the substrate, and then we grow the 3.5. And down here you can see those are the steps in SEM images. What you might notice is that these structures grow automatically, these hexagonal structures, and this is because we go on a silicon 111 and then it's those facets, it's the 111 facets that form. And this is actually very nice. So you end up with these sort of atomically smooth sidewall facets if you do it well. So here's about material characterization. So we demonstrate in the past gallium arsenide and indium phosphide is much easier to grow binary material than ternary material, because you always have say 50-50 unless you do something wrong. Whereas the moment you have ternary compounds, it can be hard to tune your growth, especially in MOCVD, because it also depends on, let's say, the diffusion on top of your sample. But here we're actually very happy. We are targeting something like 50% indium, and we probably have in between 50 and 60%. And this, of course, is indium composition, because eventually we would like to be lattice matched to indium phosphide. So here's a cross section in a device, and here's the EDS map done in TM. And we can see also here we have really an epitaxial connection to the silicon substrate. We do not see any, let's say, dislocations in the good devices here. But you do have stacking faults. I have to mention this in this type of growth, as you generally do when you grow MOCVD nanostructures. You might notice these sort of two teeth here going into substrate. This is just because when we are planarizing this, we use PCVD, and PCVD tends to form these channels, and then we use an HF step that opens them up. This we have actually now changed, so we're using a combination of PCVD and ALD to really get a flat substrate here, but it doesn't really impact our properties much. So here's device performance at 300 Kelvin. So as these are pumped at 880 nanometers, we use pulsed. So we have a supercontinuum pump source here, and we can see eventually we see this appearing of this resonant peak. This is perhaps more clear here if you're looking at this graph. So here we have the gray line, it's just the bulk emission with increasing excitation power. And we can see at one point here, the bulk emission and the resonance peak deviates, and we observe this sort of resonant emission coming up. If we compare with earlier devices, we made them indium phosphide. So these are new InGaAs samples. So this really allows us to access the interesting wavelengths around 1,530 nanometers here. But of course, these devices also, these are larger than the ones we had before. We're about now 1.5 micrometer wide and 300 nanometer thick, whereas the ones we had in gallium arsenide and indium phosphide were much smaller, about 500 nanometers. So we're interested also in general in reducing the size of the active material and stabilize the emission of the microdisc. And this is because we are, again, really working with with silicon electronics in mind. And in this respect, the 3-5 photonic components are still very large, even if they're, let's say, just a few hundred nanometers. And this is what I look at in the last part of my talk here, is cavity scaling and thermal effects. So there are a number of groups working on these metal-clad or metallodielectric nanolasers. And of course, it's clear if you have a nanolaser, you bring metals close, you're gonna have losses because metals are very absorptive. You can say if you want to go towards electrical actuation, you're going to have the metals there anyway, and you will have to live with relatively high loss. However, there's still some advantages, so to say, by exploring metals. One is the downscaling capability. As it's done here, you can work on these, let's say, hybrid photonic plasmonic lasers. There's also groups exploring the dynamics in these structures. You might get faster operation. And not least improved heat sinking. This is similar to our work we've done. This is just on cadmium selenide, sort of 2D structures. We're working with 3D microdisc, and we can see by using a metal cavity around, we can really shift lasing or resonant emission to much smaller cavity sizes. Then there's perhaps more elegant use of metals is using just these nano antennae, and this can help solve another issue with nanolasers, is that it's really hard to couple light out efficiently because you're generally just scattering light out in many directions. And by using an optimized nano antenna, you can improve this and also stabilize the wavelength selectivity. So this is, I'm going a bit fast, so really ask questions afterwards. I'm trying to cover a lot of work here. So here we have indium phosphide microdisc. I want to mention that in this case, we actually used etch structures. So you use wafer bonding, and then we etch out the disk we want. We use the same geometry as in the taste grown, but we use this approach simply because it really allows us to explore a large variety in geometries and different devices, which is not possible if we have to each time grow a new sample. The idea is in the long run to transfer these findings onto the monolithically grown devices. So here we're basically comparing such structures here with just pure indium phosphide. There's a 6 silicon dioxide, so HHQ, used for the patterning and etching on top. You might not see this so clearly. And then the similar devices cladded with gold with a thin aluminium oxide in between. It might look rough here, but this is all above the indium phosphide. The indium phosphide is buried here below 500 nanometers of oxide. So actually, if you look at cross section, it looks pretty smooth where we have the indium phosphide cavity. So this is an example of 2 devices with and without gold. So the red one here has gold, and the other one is the one without metal. And when we're increasing the emission for a 400 nanometer wide cavity from the indium phosphide, we will never see really a resonant mode. We just keep increasing the sort of the bulk emission here. Whereas in the case of a metal clad structure, we do see the appearance of a resonant emission peak. So if we're looking here, what we did here is look at a lot of different geometries, both hexagons, squares, and discs. Actually, we don't really see much different in this geometry. So the open symbols here are for the metal clad structures, and the closed are for the purely photonic structures. And we can see, of course, as expected, we do have a higher threshold for the metal clad ones because the metal introduce additional loss. However, we can also scale these substantially beyond the photonic devices and still have resonant emission. Actually, interestingly, if we look at 100 Kelvin, we do not see much difference in the threshold for the 2. And here we can really scale the devices down to about 150 nanometers for the metal clad structures. So there's a lot of debate as to why this happens. We believe that probably in the smaller structures, we do have hybrid plasmonic photonic modes, but we are not polarization sensitive, so we cannot really determine this for sure. And there's, even if you're not in a hybrid plasmonic photonic mode, you can still benefit from the metals. And this is what we found out in this study. And for the larger structures, we believe we actually just have a conventional photonic mode, perhaps with a slightly increased reflectivity because of metal. But the big deal is actually the heat sinking. So this is shown here by a simulation study. So we are looking at devices either without gold. So this is the indium phosphide with an oxide cladding. The ones which are gold cladded, as in our experimental work, where the gold is also covering the substrate, and something in between where we consider just a gold ring. And if we can look here, so this is the simulated temperature for 3 cases. With the gold all over, as in our experimental devices, we barely see an increase in temperature. It's only about, say, a few tens of Kelvin, whereas in the without gold case, we actually see a really dramatic increase in temperature for these nanolasers. And this is simulated using sort of realistic pump conditions, but with a CV, the same average power. But we see an increase in temperature up to about 800 Kelvin, it's about 500 degrees. So you might think this is very exaggerated. We did it first as well. So we're actually really trying to establish this experimentally. Right now, we're looking at Raman investigations, where you can recalibrate this, and we can see that this is actually true. We do see a really dramatic increase in temperature for the devices, and this is helped a lot by adding metal. The heat sinking is very important, and this might also explain then in some ways the improved performance for some of these devices. So last, as I mentioned, gold has a lot of absorption, and that's bad for the threshold. So another way of using it is, instead of having a metal clad cavity, is just to export antennas. And this is what we did here. So here we have the same cavities like before, just etched out in indium phosphide. And here we have a sample like this, where we place a gold nanorod on top. And here we have experimented this way. We actually made a lot of devices. We're looking at different areas and also different orientations for these gold nano antenna. You can see I have to speed up here. So anyways, what we can see in most of these cases, if you get above a certain size, you will have multi-mode emission, whereas with the gold nano antenna, we can actually suppress this, so you really get single mode emission over a large range of powers. So this is what's compared here. Here, what you need to know, the Q1, this is quantile. So here we're just increasing the size of the gold antenna. In general, a larger gold antenna works better in terms of your side mode suppression, but also eventually it starts to add more loss. So we see there's an optimum in size here as well. More importantly, perhaps, is that we maintain the selectivity and also the wavelength selectivity over a wide temperature range. So here, the light curve here is for the sample with the antenna, and we can see it barely shift the emission from 200 to 300 Kelvin. Whereas if we're looking at the sample without an antenna, first of all, we have at higher temperatures this multi-mode emission, but also we can see that the emission peak really shifts significantly. So this helps make your temperature more stable in these nano laser designs. So to summarize, I showed you the TACE epitaxial growth technique and illustrated how we use this, but for microdisc as well, these hybrid photonic crystal structures where we can really integrate 3-5s locally. Also, it allows us to grow in plane 3-5 doping and heterojunctions. And in the very end, I show you how we're exploiting the use of metals for cavity scaling and upcoupling optimization. Outlook, of course, we're looking on working on electrical actuation. We don't have this yet. But we do have LED emission. This is something that was done in the same way first, where we have the hybrid photonic crystal, because those structures also have an embedded PIN junction. So it's not lasering yet, but LED emission coming out. We're also exploring topological features in these 1D nanobeam structures. And as I mentioned earlier, we are trying right now to quantify the temperature increase experimentally using Raman. And this is also work which will hopefully come out shortly. And in the end, I would like to acknowledge those group members who contribute to this. So in terms of nanophotonics, there's my postdoc, Noelia, and there's PhD students, Svenja, Preksha, and Marcos. In terms of 3-5 growth and characterization, there's Heinz is in charge of really the growth development. Marilyn is our in-house TEM and material analysis expert. And thermal simulations were done by Peng Yan and Ben Gotsman. And I would also really like to thank our collaborators externally to ETH. We are collaborating a lot with Professor Schenk and Professor Leutold at the ETH. Also in Hanbat University in Daejeon, Professor Xiangwan Li and Martha Russell at EMPA. And of course, and then thanks to all of you for listening in to this virtual conference. This is our group, the MIND team, IBM in 2021. We are just finally able, after COVID, to do our first in-person group event. And funding, I would like to thank both the ERC, the SNF, and Marie Curie, who contributes to this. And thank you very much. And if you have questions, you can ask them here. You're welcome to mail me anytime. So.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, for the nice talk. So we have a bit of time, not too much, for a couple of questions. So okay, I see some people wants to. So Jennifer.
Sorry, Frederick, that was applause.
Okay. Is there any question? I've seen some hands. No?
Otherwise, you're also welcome to write me.
Okay. So just one quick question. So you mentioned the interest of using metallic structures for faster modulation with nano devices. Do you have more comments on that, or?
No, not. To be honest, we have not explored the dynamics so much. We do lifetime measurements in those devices here, and we do see, let's say, lifetimes are shorter for metal plate devices. It's not surprising because you also introduce loss, and I think that's the same. Let's say, on one hand, the loss is bad. On the other hand, it might actually help make faster devices, and some groups are looking into this. We have not really done this yet, also because we're also only using optical pumping, so it might not be so relevant at this stage. But this is really a consideration, and also some work where people propose that actually having, let's say, plasmonic devices, even if you just have an LED, might be comparable to having a conventional photonic lasers, also in terms of speed. But it's a trade-off, because you have to take the loss into account.
What is a typical photon lifetime in your microdisc laser?
Honestly, this I cannot say on top of my head. We're limited in terms of the resolution of the setup. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 40 picosecond. So we cannot measure very fast responses. That's why we cannot do lifetime on all devices. It depends on how much light we have out. So we can do it on the microdiscs, but we haven't been able to do so simply because of the resolution for the photonic crystal structures.
Okay, thank you. Is there any more question in the audience? Nope. Right. Okay, so I think we can close this opening session. So we can thanks a lot the two speakers, so Professor Keller for this nice keynote talk, and Kirsten from IBM, both are from Zurich actually. So thank you very much for giving these two talks, and we can take just 1 or 2 minutes, a very short break, because the next session on high power semiconductor laser is supposed to start at 11:15. So we can just take 2 or 3 minutes maximum. Okay. So see you in a minute.
Recording stopped.
Hi, Frederick. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I am giving a presentation next session. I would like to check whether you would be able to see my slides. Is it possible quickly to test it?
Yeah, you can do it. Yeah.
Okay, just trying to share screen. And now.
Yep.
Can you see it?
It works.
Okay, just once more, I would like to see presentation modus. Can you see full screen?
No, we are not, it's not full screen.
Oh, what is wrong? Okay, not full screen, so but okay, it is kind of full screen because at the sides are black stripes, and they cannot divide them. See them in my case as well.
Hi.
Okay, I'm stopping.
So sorry.
Yes, this is the second one. Yeah, Mohammed.
Yes.
Yeah, you want to try?
Yes.
Okay. As you are the first.
Okay.
Okay, it works.
Yep.
It's not full screen. Now it's full screen. Okay.
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 Okay, sorry for the short delay. So hello, everybody. My name is...
Just wait, the session has not started yet.
Ah, okay, I'm sorry. I was just away from the keyboard for a second, sorry. Mm-hmm.
So Johan Peter, I will give you the floor to chair the session.
Yes, I try. Okay, but Frederick, you have to tell me when we should start.
Let's wait 1 more minute.
Okay.
So normally we have 3 talks. Huh?
Yeah, so where is the third author here, or presenter?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Alberto.
Okay, I think we should start now, isn't it?
Yeah, you can go. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know if you...
Recording in progress.
Okay. Yeah, so I would like to welcome you to the first scientific session of the workshop, which is on high power semiconductor lasers. And there are 3 talks, and the first one will be given by Mohamed El-Attar from Werner Braun Institute in Berlin. And you see the title already, so please start.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm Mohamed El-Attar from the Werner Braun Institute in Berlin, and today I'm going to be talking about the impact of vertical structure on thermal lensing and lateral beam quality in high-power broad area diode lasers. First, I'm going to start with a motivation for broad area diode lasers. Then I'm going to introduce beam quality in broad area lasers and the mechanisms that affect it. Then I'm going to review some experimental studies about the impact of vertical structure on lateral beam quality. Then I'm going to present a simulation model based on finite element analysis using ANSYS. Then I'm going to present some simulation results and findings. And finally, I'm going to end with a summary. So broad area diode lasers offer the highest power conversion efficiency among all light sources. Therefore, they're used in a wide range of applications, including industrial space applications, among others. In addition to conversion efficiency, high beam quality is also required, which is essentially a measure of how well the beam can be focused in a small spot size. This is crucial for applications such as material processing, like cutting, welding, and drilling, where the broad area lasers are either used directly or as pump sources for solid-state lasers. Thus, it is crucial to enhance the performance of broad area lasers, which is necessary to reduce the cost per watt of useful power in these applications. So for beam quality in broad area lasers, first in the vertical fast axis, the laser beam has nearly single mode operation. So the beam quality is close to the ideal diffraction limited profile with an M² close to 1. It experiences strong divergence, as you see here, but can easily be refocused using lenses. In the other axis, the lateral or slow axis, the laser supports a large number of modes, which means that the beam quality is much lower than the ideal diffraction limiter profile with the M² significantly greater than 1. Typically, the lateral beam quality is quantified using the beam parameter product, which is calculated as the product of 1/4 multiplied by the near field width and far field angle with 95% of the total optical power content. And just a note that that low beam parameter product corresponds to high lateral beam quality. So like any other device, broad area lasers have non-zero thermal resistance, or thermal. So with increasing optical power, it experiences increasing active zone temperature, which is calculated using this formula. So it's the difference of the electrical power and optical power multiplied by the thermal resistance. And we know from experiment that typically the beam parameter product follows a linear trend with increasing active zone temperature, as you see here. Where there is a constant term that we call BPP0 and a slope term, which we call S thermal. So first, the non-thermal background level, BPP0, the constant term, is affected, for example, by process-induced guiding, like index guiding trenches, for example, or packaging-induced guiding, like built-up strain due to epi-down soldering. On the other hand, the thermal slope can be affected by, for example, thermal lensing, which we will focus on today, which is basically that due to buildup or due to lateral temperature variation within the structure, a local refractive index profile is built up, which allows the guiding of a large number of higher order modes. Other mechanisms that can affect the thermal slope, for example, are current spreading and lateral carrier accumulation at the stripe edges. So before I move on, I just want to shortly show the epitaxial layer structures that I will be comparing today. So first we have asymmetric super large optical cavity or ASLOC structure. And we also have an extreme double asymmetric or EDAS prototype. So what's the difference between them? The ASLOC structure has a relatively thick P waveguide that you see here. There is asymmetry in the aluminum content in the N and P cladding layers, as you see here. And in comparison to the EDAS structure, it has a higher conversion efficiency and slightly lower thermal resistance with about 0.05 Kelvin per watt, which we know from design, but is within measurement tolerance. So it's a small difference. On the other hand, for the EDAS prototype design, it has an added asymmetry in the thickness of the P waveguide and the N waveguide layer and the P waveguide layer. So basically it has a very thin P waveguide layer, as you see here. And why we do this is to reduce the typically high absorption and series resistance on the P side of the diode laser. It has a double quantum well to compensate for the lower confinement. As you see here, the fundamental vertical mode does not overlap very well with the active zone. So that's why it has a double quantum well. And as mentioned, in comparison to the ASLOC design, it has a lower conversion efficiency and slightly higher thermal resistance. So for the experimental studies, we used this approach. It's a thermal camera imaging approach of the front facet of the broad area laser, where the chip is mounted P-side down on a copper tungsten submount under continuous wave or CW operation. And the way this approach works is by imaging the mid-infrared or MIR thermal radiation onto a detector, followed by calibration, giving an image such as this one. As you see here, this image can then be used to obtain the lateral thermal profile within the plane of the active zone, as you see here. And some limitations to this approach, for example, is that the spatial resolution is limited by the relatively long wavelength of the mid-infrared radiation. And also the lateral profile you see here is broadened by the propagation of the mid-infrared radiation inside the chip. Afterwards, we apply a quadratic fit function, as you see here in red, to the lateral thermal profile within plus minus 60 micrometer from the center. And we use the quadratic term of the fit function, which we will call Boeing or B2, as a measure of the thermal lens strength. So what we do next is we compare the variation of this B2 or thermal lens Boeing between the two structures, the ASLOC and EDAS, at different operating points. And what we see is that in EDAS, this Boeing variation rate, which we will call MB, for example, is significantly higher in EDAS compared to ASLOC. When we separately also measure the beam quality like near field and far field and apply linear fits to the beam parameter product versus active zone plots, a similar trend is observed where the thermal slope in the EDAS is also significantly higher than in ASLOC. So what can we deduce from this is that there is a direct proportionality between this MB, which is the Boeing variation rate, and between the thermal slope. So what does this mean? It means that if we can simulate the lateral thermal profile at different operating points for any vertical structure, and then analyze the variation of the thermal lens Boeing, as we do here, we can then be able to estimate the impact of any potential vertical design change on the lateral beam quality. Okay, so we thus created a simulation model using ANSYS parametric design language to carry out finite element analysis. So we create a two-dimensional cross-sectional model of the broad area laser chip, which includes all epitaxial and metallization layers, where the chip is mounted P-side down on a copper tungsten submount, so identical to the experimental configuration. We include accurate thermal conductivity values for each material, as well as density, specific heat capacity, and thermal expansion coefficients for each material. And we assume a uniform longitudinal thermal profile for simplicity. What we do next is that we calculate the heat generated within the chip at every operating point and distributed appropriately along the layers. So each layer is modeled as a heat source with a thermal density, which is the sum of the recombination, Joule, and absorption heat densities. And after extracting the simulated lateral thermal profiles, we do a vertical averaging over ±5 micrometer around the active zone. So for better comparability with the thermal camera images, which, as mentioned, have a limited spatial resolution. So if we compare the two-dimensional thermal profiles extracted from the camera and extracted from the simulation, we see a clear difference. First of all, the absolute temperature values are significantly higher in the camera image compared to simulation. And we see that the transfer of heat from the chip to the metallic carrier is much lower in the thermal camera image compared to the simulation. So what we were able to deduce from this is that the P-side semiconductor metal interface exhibits a large thermal boundary, or so-called Kapitsa resistance, having this value of 7 × 10⁻⁻⁶ meters square Kelvin per watt. And this, as you see here, it limits the transfer of heat out of the chip and increases the total thermal resistance of the mounting configuration. If we want to reproduce measurement results in simulation, we found that we have to change the simulation by including a thermal barrier layer at this boundary between the semiconductor and the metal with a relatively high thermal resistance to be able to reproduce the measurement results in simulation. If we look here at the vertical and lateral thermal profile, so first in the vertical profile, we see the measurement results here in black and gray experience this temperature step at the interface, which is not there in the simulation without the barrier. But when we include the barrier, here shown in red, we again see this temperature step. Also in the lateral profile is the same. So the simulation without barrier, the temperature is quite low. Then when we include the barrier, it starts to become more similar to the measurement. Of course, we notice here that the simulated profile is significantly narrower than the one from the experiment. And we believe this is because the simulation does not include the aforementioned mid-infrared radiation broadening. So what we do next is that we carry out ANSYS simulations for the SLOC and EDAS lasers at different operating points, and we repeat the measurements twice, once without like the thermal barrier and once with. So without the thermal barrier, if we compare again the B2, which is the thermal lens Boeing with increasing active zone temperature, we see that this Boeing variation rate, or MB, is very similar in both of them. There is almost no difference. While when we start including a thermal barrier, we start to see this effect that we saw earlier in measurement, where the EDAS experiences a stronger variation. So what this tells us is that this confirms what we knew before, is that to reproduce measurement results in simulation, we need to include this thermal barrier layer. Then we start to go further by changing the value or the strength of this barrier layer. So we change the thermal resistance of thermal barrier layer, which corresponds to increasing the Kapitsa resistance at the semiconductor metal boundary. And what we see, first of all, so here in blue is what we saw up there, is that the Boeing variation rate increases as we increase the strength of the thermal barrier. And what we observe is that this correlates with also an increase in the contrast in thermal resistance, okay, between the two structures. So how do we interpret this? We interpret this that when we include the thermal barrier layer, this limits the transfer of generated heat out of the chip into the metal layers. So it increases the propagation of heat inside the chip, for example, laterally within the layers, within semiconductor layers. So any contrast between the structures becomes more pronounced, which corresponds to this increased thermal resistance difference. And this increases the impact of the vertical design on the thermal slope and beam quality. The next question is this variation that we observe in the thermal lens Boeing and thermal resistance and lateral beam parameter product between the different vertical structures, is this a result of simply different spatial distributions of the heat sources, like heat is generated in different parts, or is it due to the different thermal conductivity profiles of the epitaxial layer structures? So to answer this question, we repeat the same simulation, but now instead of a realistic distribution of heat sources over the structure, we assume that all the heat is generated within the active zone. So the active zone is the one heat source here. And when we repeat the measurement, we found that there is almost no difference in this MB, the Boeing variation rate. So this indicates that the spatial distribution of heat sources is not responsible for the thermal lens variation, but it's rather the difference in the thermal conductivity profiles of the two epitaxial layer structures. So what we can conclude here is that by altering the vertical structure and its thermal conductivity profile, we could weaken the thermal lens, thereby reducing the thermal slope and improving the lateral beam quality. So let me summarize and conclude. So we have discussed that experimental studies have shown that vertical structure variation has a significant impact on thermal lens strength and thus on lateral beam quality in broad area lasers. We have carried out thermal simulations based on finite element analysis to study this effect by comparing the variation of thermal lens bowing with increasing active zone temperature in different epitaxial layer designs. In agreement with previous studies, the simulation results have showed that to reproduce the experimental trend in simulation, we need to include the thermal barrier layer to represent the Kapitsa or thermal boundary resistance at the P-side semiconductor metal interface. Simulations also showed that in the presence of the thermal barrier, which limits heat transfer out of the chip, the contrast between the vertical structures becomes more pronounced, leading to a larger thermal resistance difference and results in a stronger variation in B2 and thus beam parameter product. And finally, we repeat the simulations with a single heat source to prove that the contrast between vertical structures is not a result of different heat source distributions, but rather different thermal conductivity profiles. Finally, the authors would like to thank TRUM for supporting parts of this work, and I want to thank you all for your attention, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you. Yeah, so questions from the audience? So please raise your hands. Yes, so there's a question from Gay Lucas.
Yes, yeah, I have a question regarding the temperature profile measurement. I always have some concern regarding the plane in which you make that kind of measurement with an infrared camera. And so you discussed about the lateral broadening of the signal in the mid-infrared. But what about the longitudinal broadening? And do you have any information on or simulation on the integration longitudinal, do you understand my question?
Yes, I think so. So of course, the same broadening has also an effect longitudinally, and this I think is referred to in the published papers as the information depth, I believe, which basically says that there is like a 1 millimeter smoothing of the longitudinal profile, and actually, so this is kind of positive in a way, because it means what we see is the front facet is not the extremely high temperatures we expect directly at the front facet, but it's more an averaging of like along the resonator.
Okay, so it's about 1 millimeter. It's a temperature over 1 millimeter. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so we are a little bit late in time, but so is there still a very quick, important question? Then it can be accepted. So it seems to be not. Okay, then I would like to thank the speaker again.
Thank you very much.
And we should come now to the second talk from. So it's on cascaded polarization coupling of high power broad area semiconductor lasers, and the talk will be given by Ratsunias from Weierstrass Institute, also in Berlin.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, can you make full screen?
Okay, just a minute. Is it okay?
Not yet.
Oh. Can you see something or not really?
Yes, but it's in a small mode.
Okay, small amount. Okay, if it is say, so that's okay. So because what we have here, do you have the say 2% of screen at least?
No, we see the screen, but it's not in full scale. So
okay, full scale. But do you see 80% approximately of the screen?
Okay, then maybe I see 60%, but
60.
still everything, but it's smaller. Okay, if you cannot enlarge.
I guess I would have problems. So it would take.
Okay, then please continue. Otherwise.
Okay.
Except there would be a strong complaint if somebody cannot read things, or then we should do something.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Doesn't. Okay. So please start.
Okay. My name is Mindaugas Radžiūnas. I'm from Berchtesgaden Institute in Berlin, Germany. So, and in this talk, I will speak about mainly theoretical aspects of cascaded polarization coupling of high-power broad array lasers. The job was done in cooperation with several colleagues from companies Monochrome and Rap Photonic, so in the frame of some Eurostars project. Outline is first I will introduce modeling approach, then I will discuss how to model light filter at optical feedback. Next, I will introduce cascaded polarization coupling of two power and emitters, discuss some simulations and measurements, and conclusions will be drawn. Okay, so mathematical model of which I'm using in simulation, so consists of two big parts. It's electro-optical problem. It's electro-optical model, which I'm using for dynamic simulations of optical fields and carriers over, say, several nanoseconds, and of heat flow model, so which I'm using to correct parameter values, take into account temperatures within the active zone. So this electro-optical model is acting. Electro-optical model is acting on the active zone, so it is described in lateral and longitudinal coordinates. So heat flow model actually accounts for all three-dimensional thermal distributions. So these models are connected iteratively. So that means several nanosecond calculations of electro-optical models will provide some time average distributions to heat flow solver, where they are serving as heat sources. And heat flow model, so the static heat flow model provides temperature distributions within the active zone, so which gives effects to several parameters such as refractive index. In this talk, I mainly concentrate about the effects of optical feedback. Optical feedback enters traveling wave equations, which are part of electronic solar. So, and I assume that this feedback is acting in the lateral and longitudinal dimensions. So, and assuming that within the vertical dimension, everything is perfect. That means I have very nice fast access collimators and they cause no problems. The optical feedback enters the field equations, so through the boundary conditions and the front facet. So, and formally, so feedback operator, capital F in the white box, can be written as integral operator, non-local integral operator in general. So where integration kernel K, so depends on the geometry of external cavity, on the optical elements which are hidden in the external cavity, and so on. So actually, it is a big mathematical problem. So because each external cavity provides different operators K, and another big numerical problem because evaluation of such operators can be quite expensive, numerically expensive. Therefore, we're looking for appropriate approximations of this feedback operator and for appropriate external cavities which allow to have local feedback, local in time and space feedback. Okay, so one of examples of such local in space and time feedback, so is provided by simple configuration, laser configuration, which is shown below. So that means that we have broad array laser, perfectly located lens, fast axis, slow axis collimating lens, and mirror. And feedback in such configuration can be written by local operator. That means feedback F1E so is equal optical field, emitted optical field at facet with swapped lateral coordinate x and with some delay tau. So, in this case, so everything can be done. So simulations can be performed quickly without big, how to say, stopping of the simulations. And if we have such kind of feedback, so we can do simulations. So now let's talk about layered filtering. What does layered filtering? Layered filters are composed from couples of polarization beam splitters. This is lila boxes in my diagram, and by birefringent crystals, which are blue boxes in the diagram. So they can have several stages. They can have only a single stage. So it is not so important. So, and a layered filter involves vertical and horizontally polarized field components. So, and provides frequency or wavelength periodic transmission of the field. That's action of layered filter in our configurations. So I need to admit that, okay, polarization components, that means beam splitters, depending on the input direction. So beam splitters either they are allowed for some polarization component to go through, and another polarization component is sent to another out, so another way. When modeling a birefringent crystal propagation, I account for refractive indices and group indices along the ordinary and extraordinary axis of the crystal. So, and within birefringent polarization components communicate the exchange values actually. So, and if external cavity constructed properly, that means if again, so lens is located in proper distance from our emitter, so we again can show that feedback in such cavities so can be written as sum of local operators. It is written below in this page. So, and here these operators depend noted as tau ij, and these delays are dependent on the group indices along the ordinary extraordinary axis of the birefringent crystal. That means again, so I can have pretty inexpensive methods to resolve optical feedback in such idealized cavity. Okay, now about coupling of several lasers. In this diagram, I show that I can attach another emitter, here denoted as broad array laser 2, so through the other input port of the beam splitter. Yeah, here additionally I have to put a half wave plate in order to have my optical field not lost in this cavity. So afterwards, I can take these two lasers, similar coupled two lasers, and attach a similar pair of lasers through the beam splitter of the stage 2. Then 4 lasers can be attached through the beam splitter port at the stage 3, and so on. In such a manner, in such a manner, I can combine up to 2 power m coupled lasers, so coupled through different stages into single output. Yeah. So here I draw attention that these small gray boxes, which you can see in this diagram, so actually they represent a lambda over 2 power m wave plates, and there are selected number, some special number of such wave plates located here. So, and these, once the number of such wave plates are taken properly in each gray box position, then we can achieve that self-reflection spectra of each emitter are perfectly interleaved. So the upper figure here is an example of 8 coupled lasers and of self of these 8 lasers. So it depends on colors. There are 8 colors here. So, and we see that everything is perfectly interleaved. And once we have lasing of the laser itself wavelength, which correspond to some resonance, so laser becomes full possible feedback. Okay, around, okay, it's not only self-reflection, there are some cross-reflections. So in cross-reflections, you can see in panel B of the figure. So that means black line logarithmic scale shows self-reflection, and the colored lines shows cross-reflections from other lasers at similar wavelengths, if they emit at these wavelengths. Finally, panel C shows that if we're gray curve in the panel C shows that if we're outside of this resonance frequency, we will have losses within the external cavity. So that means if laser, which is supposed to laze at the tuning value 0, so lasers at some other wavelength, this lasing wavelength is lost within external cavity. It is actually redirected in a different direction, in wrong direction at the beam splitters. Okay, so why this is needed? Why this interleaving is needed? So in this figure, so I'm showing that doing simulations. Once doing simulations, so with such kind of configuration of two lasers here, so I'm really also getting similar calculated optical spectra. These are shown in the upper diagram. So there are three different calculations corresponding to three different lengths of the birefringent crystals. Something similar, it was obtained also in experiments, which were done in the company Monochrome in Spain. So here where instead of coupling two lasers, here people were coupling two laser arrays. So the main aim was, of course, to achieve high power. So and with laser arrays, one can achieve bigger powers. And they also got this interleaving spectrum. Why this interleaving is necessary? So I still not answered this question. So this question probably is answered in the following figure. So in the upper row of this figure, I show what happens in the single laser. So I have optical spectra, it is left. I have near field, it is middle, and I have far fields, it is right figure. Once I have nicely connected more lasers, 2 lasers, 4 lasers, 8 lasers, or 16 lasers at different rows of this. So here I have optical spectra of all these emitters. In the middle and right diagrams, I have near fields and far fields of these configurations, where thick gray lines are representing scaled combined beam. What I see from this figure, that combined beam characteristics, namely width of optical spectra and near and far fields, remain similar to those of the solitary diode. Our power is scaled by the number of emitters. How good the scaling is, so I am discussing in the next figure. So for this reason, I'm introducing coupling efficiency, which is ratio of the emitted power of the combined beam to the sum of the emissions at different emitters. So here I was considering 2 lasers. I was investigating some impact of some parameters of the external cavity. I had drawn conclusions, and I saw that in the best case for 2 lasers, I was getting 88% of efficiency. Okay, it is not so optimistic in experiments, so because they were coming up to 80% of efficiency, which is smaller. But here I have to mention that I'm using, in my modeling, I'm using idle, lossless, and perfectly located optical elements without parasitic backscattering. And I'm assuming quality mode emission from the emitters, which is not the case in the experiments. So that's the discrepancy between these coupling efficiency factors. Okay, next. In next figure, so I am showing example of 8 emitters. And if looking at the lower diagram at the red curve, I see that emissions efficiency in principle consists of 2 parts, two multipliers. That means eta contains a factor which is in principle transmission through the external, this 1 minus RE, and another factor is transmission through the cavity, where A stands for losses within the cavity due to imperfect filtering. And I see that, for example, here, so depending on the reflectivity of the external mirror, so I get more or less the same transmission through the external cavity, or more or less the same value of losses once this reflectivity RE is above 2%. This red line in the lower diagram. So it is more or less saturated. And of course, if I have smaller reflectivities of outcoupling mirrors, so I have insufficient filtering, and I have different wavelengths at the emissions of individual lasers, and I have a loss of losses within the external cavity. Therefore, coupling efficiency drops down when reflectivities of mirror are too small. Okay, probably the last figure. In this case, until now, I assume that everything is perfect. The external cavity is ideal, and there are no extra losses. If assuming that I have some extra losses within each coupling stage, and I have denoted these lamp losses as parameter mu, then my coupling efficiency nu so follows the formula written here, so at the right side. And of course, if I'm looking for this emission independence loss per stage mu, so it is middle diagram in the figure, so I see that this efficiency goes down. 3 lines here shows different configurations, having 4-stage, 3-stage, 2-stage, or 1-stage. That means coupled 2 lasers, 2 coupled 16 lasers. However, in all cases, losses A, that means losses which are induced due to bad filtering, are staying more or less the same. So in each configuration, independently on loss per stage factor mu, but they are changing if I using different number of coupled lasers. So these are lower diagram. Okay, coming to conclusions. So I have a lot of items, but the most important probably are 3 listed in blue. So I have shown that cascaded external cavity admits a perfect interleaving and self-perfection spectra of 2 power m rotary lasers. So most important combined beam characteristics remain similar to that one of the solitary diode, whereas tau is scaled by the number of emitters. And the last but not least, better efficiency one has to reduce losses induced by all these ends. Okay, that means this was a message from the last slide, previous slide. So in order to couple more lasers and more lasers and more lasers and not to lose efficiency, we have to have a small amount of losses as possible within the external cavity. And okay, thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. So we are really running out of time. So if there is a very important question, then please raise your hands. Okay, seems not the case. Otherwise, we have to skip the lunch break. I don't think that anybody is happy with this. So let's go to the next speaker. So thank you very much.
Okay.
So the next speaker is Maina from Convergent Photonics in Torino.
Yes. Hello.
So the title is already shown. We should not waste more time, so please start.
Can you see the slide? So thank you. Hi, I am Alberto Maina from Convergent Photonics. And today I'm going to show our works on changes of high-power laser diode characteristics with stress-induced reduction of the degree of polarization. First, I'm going to show the motivation of our work and a short introduction to the diode laser design. Then analysis and results will be presented and some conclusion will be taken. Nowadays, high-power laser modules are widely used to pump fiber laser for a wide range of applications. High brightness, high efficiency, and compact laser source are required. So some key technologies have to be developed. Power scaling, in fact, can be achieved through high-efficient broad area lasers, which permit to obtain a control wavelength emission through an optimized design. Moreover, the control of polarization purity is important. It's a key parameter related to the beam and device quality and permit to enable the polarization multiplexing. In fact, the optical beam combination can be avoiding the beam losses, can be achieved distinguish, for example, photons basing on their degree of polarization. We have to combine two different beams. The first with a main polarization, for example, the TE. The first beam, TE beam, passes through the PBC, the polarization beam combiner, while the second beam is firstly rotated by the alpha wave rotator and then reflected from the PBC. The two output beams have a different polarization state, so ideally the output power can be doubled, maintaining the same lateral beam, the same beam quality that can be measured through the beam parameter product. However, high polarization purity is required. In this figure, we can see the real devices with the PBC and the two beams that are combined here. So the degree of polarization defined, named DOP, is a key factor to minimize the output power losses, and it's defined as the ratio between the T power and the total power. Our laser diodes are a broad area laser with an asymmetric gradient index separate confined heterostructure that permit to achieve both vertical confinement along the slow axis direction and lateral photon confinement. With the use of an indium gallium arsenide compressibly strained quantum well, single quantum well, we are able to emit in the 9th excess nanometer region with an high polarization purity. In fact, at the operating condition, the TE gain is much higher than the TM1. Also, electro-optical properties are very good. High slope efficiency, low series resistance, and high wall plug efficiency are achieved through a Fabry-Perot of about 4.5 millimeters length. However, we observe that the DOP is degraded due to the induction of the photoelastic effect. So, for this reason, simulation of the stress distribution on the waveguide is very important to understand how the refractive index is perturbed. The refractive index became a tensor, and evaluating the birefringence effect, we are able to study the polarization changes and how the DOP is degraded from a pure T from a pure T beam to a component, a spurious component, the TM1, which arises on the edge of the waveguide. Another important problem is the optical filamentation, which is defined as the highly irregularity of the emitted profile. This is a phenomenon that has a chaotic behavior, which implies a reliability problem caused by the COMD, catastrophic optical mirror damage. Moreover, we observe that T and TM beams have different characteristics. So modeling and an experimental analysis are required. The first is necessary to reproduce the slow axis and near field and far field beam. In figure, we can are represented modeled and measured beams, while the experimental analysis is necessary to confirm model prediction. We use a strong statistical method with a high number of measured devices. Moreover, a particular metrics have to be detected to evaluate results and observation. To evaluate the irregularity of the near field, we select three main parameters: the intensity peak position respect the waveguide width, the RMS, which permit to analyze the variability of the profile respect the mean value, and the ratio between the max intensity peak and its mean value. Using these metrics, we are able to study how the optical filamentation varying with the stress applied to the semiconductor lasers, which stress that can be made is strongly related to the DOP degradation. As said before, the T and TM beams are quite different. The near field TM is a map of the stress along the lateral position. In this figure, each vertical slice represents a near field, which intensity is shown using the color bar. So a map like this is composed by hundreds of devices, and the near field TM is represented as a function of the DOP and the lateral position. We observe that when the DOP is high, the peak intensity are located on the edges of the waveguide, as reported in literature. However, when the DOP decreases, the filamentation of the beam becomes more regular, and the field goes toward the center of the waveguide. In fact, with DOP reduction, low-order modes are excited. The intensity peak position moves statistically toward the center of the waveguide. Intensity ratio and RMS slightly decreases. On the contrary, considering TE maps, when the DOP is very high, the near field profile is quite regular, ideally very similar to a topet profile. On the reducing the DOP and increasing the applied stress, the filamentation becomes more irregular. This, in fact, because with the DOP reduction, high order modes are more involved. In fact, the intensity ratio and the variability of the beam are increased. So different mode excitation affects the beam near field shape properties, and consequently also the lateral divergence. In fact, high DOP devices show a TE beam that show a narrow divergence respect to the TM1, which is light that is composed by the highest order mode available. When the DOP is reduced, TE and TM light become similar and are composed by the same, a similar set of optical modes. So the lateral divergence becomes similar. This has a strong impact on the lateral beam quality. In fact, with the DOP reduction, the lateral beam quality decreases with an increase of the beam parameter product. The reduction of the DOP due to a strong external stress affects also the leave properties of the diode laser. In fact, with the DOP reduction, we observe an increase of the threshold current and a reduction of the slope efficiency, resulting in a loss of optical power at fixed injected current. It's important to underline that this analysis was performed on bars devices that came from the same process. This in order to guarantee the best uniformity of the optical electrical properties. This difference between the two categories is due to the mounting process of the chip on the submounts on the carrier. A possible explanation of this behavior is that at operating wavelength, the TE gain is much higher than the TM1, so TM photons can be considered as an internal loss. Moreover, as said before, TM live on high order modes, which are affected by higher propagation losses. By a simple use of the stationary rate equation and combine the gain distribution respect carrier density and the wavelength, we can demonstrate that the threshold current on low DOP devices is higher than on high DOP devices. So an analysis of the threshold current and the slope efficiency can be conducted as a function of the DOP. By limiting the stress applied to the semiconductor lasers, we can improve the beam quality, obtaining a more regular near field. This is a very regular near field where the T components represent the greatest part of the beam. we can achieve high degree and of polarization stable at all the injected current. High power and high linearity with high conversion efficiency is achieved. With this type of lasers, we can obtain laser module that show high power, more than 350 watts in continuous operation, with high conversion efficiency. In conclusion, the Doppler reduction effects on electro-optical and on beam quality was statistically investigated on many devices. We show how the laser threshold current increase with the slope efficiency, while the slope efficiency decrease. Slow axis near field has been extensively investigated. We show how that to guarantee a regular profile, the stress to be reduced. T becomes more regular, while the TM lives on the edges. And TM polarized near field represent a map of the mechanical stress. This type of observation and the selected matrix can be very useful to optimize high dop devices for our applications. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you. Yeah, so the talk is open for discussion. So maybe I have a question. I'm wondering a little bit, so the active material you have is a compressively strained indium gallium arsenide quantum well.
Correctly, yes.
So why you still have such a strong TM mode gain?
We do not have a strong TM gain at the operating condition. The TM component of the light is due to the rotation of the pure polarization state due to the.
This means it's still the gain of the TE mode, and then okay, you cannot distinguish between them.
No. TM light is emitted is due to the transition between electron energy and the light hole energy, and at operating condition this transition is not is not favored compared to the electron and the heavy hole transition. So at the operating condition, the emitted light is pure T, and we suppose that all the TM components are due to a rotation of the degree of polarization.
Okay, so this means on the other hand there is no chance that by modifying the material properties to change the degree of polarization.
At the moment, we have no evidence that it's possible.
Okay.
Because, as you said, the quantum well is compressively strained. The T eigenvalue are more favored than the TM1. So we have to reduce the effect induced by the photoelastic effect.
Okay. Yeah. Further questions? Comments? Okay, seems not the case. Then I would like to thank all the speakers from this session. And I will give
recording stopped.
Give back to Frederick.
Yes, so thank you very much, Johan Peter. And thank you very much for all the speakers for this first session. So before lunch, just a quick remark. You can still, if you want to keep exchanging, you can go to the link and to the special chat room. and it's very easy to use, and you can keep discussing with colleagues by using this channel. So it's time for lunch. So we are going back at 1:30 for the session 2 on vertical cavity surface emitting devices and applications. Okay. So enjoy your lunch, and see you at 1:30.